It all began with a scream that tore through the grand halls of Halecrest Manor. A billionaire father, once untouchable, found his empire crumbling, not because of rivals or markets, but because of a little girl's cry in the night. In that moment, the world saw him powerless, clutching his daughter as the weight of secrets, betrayal, and love collided. A stranger stood by his side, not bound by blood, but by something deeper, something that would force him to choose between power and family. Before we dive in, let us know, what time are you listening to this? And where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. The rain in Portland never rushes you. It just hangs there, a fine mist that makes stone darker and glass look older. Halecrest Manor sat at the end of a long cedar drive, elegant, expensive, and quiet in the way a museum is quiet. Lights were on. Warm even. Still, the house wouldn't breathe. Sebastian Hale started his morning the same way he always did, a cup of black coffee left to cool on the desk, 3 screens glowing with market updates, a calendar that never left room for accidents. 48, widowed, the face of a media tech empire that sold certainty for a living. He had a reputation for standards that snapped like a ruler on the back of a hand. Over the last 6 months, he'd fired 5 housekeepers for sins as small as a crooked picture frame or a missmudge on a glass door. Control felt like safety. Control also felt lonely. Upstairs, his daughter lay listening to the rain tap the window like a patient knuckle. Marigold Hale, everyone called her Goldie. 8 years old, round eyes too serious for her age, a soft knit cap covering the patchy places where treatment had taken more than she was ready to give. The private nurse kept charts and temperatures. Sebastian kept receipts and schedules. Love was there, enormous and clumsy, but it came out as logistics and signatures. Goldie didn't talk much these days. She drifted to the old upright piano in the room that used to be her mother's, touching the keys like they might bruise. Sometimes she pressed one note and let it ring until it sank back into the wood. That was the only place in the house that felt like it knew her name. Sebastian stood in the doorway more than once, wanting to ask what she needed, what would help, what would make any of this feel less like a tunnel. Every time, the words scattered. He cleared his throat, offered new books, a better air purifier, a quieter humidifier. Goldie nodded and went back to the keys. Late that morning, the intercom buzzed. At the front step stood a young woman in a plain coat beaded with rain. Curls pulled back, posture easy, eyes steady. 23, black, carrying a worn leather tote and a folded umbrella that didn't drip on the mat. Althea Rowan, she said, voice even, not timid. Here for the position. Sebastian glanced at the file, then at her. He opened the door. Something in the draft shifted as she stepped inside. The house, for once, seemed to take a breath. Sebastian Hale had a habit of examining people the same way he examined contracts, line by line, looking for flaws. After Althea Rowan's arrival that gray Portland morning, he had retreated to his office with her file in hand. The folder was thin, the type of resume that made executives like him uneasy. She had worked at a daycare, a couple of restaurants, done some in-home care. Nothing long-term, nothing that looked impressive. To him, that read as unstable. And instability was something Sebastian loathed almost as much as failure. He shut the file with a crisp snap. Trial only, he murmured to himself. We'll see how long she lasts. He'd said those same words before, and none of the last 5 had stayed longer than a few weeks. The house was still waiting to prove her wrong. By noon, the rain had grown heavier, streaking down the tall windows of Halecrest Manor. The air inside smelled faintly of polish and cedar, but it carried no warmth. Sebastian adjusted his tie and sat down in front of the 3 glowing monitors in his study. The board of Hale Global Ventures appeared one by one, men and women in tidy squares, their expressions as polished as their tailored suits. Routine numbers filled the first half hour. Charts, projections, earnings. Sebastian spoke with precision, his voice clipped, his sentences clean. But then Victor Drummond leaned forward into the camera, and the atmosphere shifted. Victor had once been a friend. They had come up together in the early days of the company, but years of competition had sharpened Victor into something harder. He smiled now, a smile that was all surface. Sebastian, he said in a tone that carried both charm and threat, we've noticed distractions. Are you sure your focus is still on the company? Rumors are, well, they travel fast. Sebastian's jaw flexed. The company is stable. Victor tilted his head, eyes gleaming. Stability requires attention. And lately, yours seems divided. I'll be frank, if you don't prove you're still the man who built this empire, the board may have to reconsider your authority. Sebastian's silence hung for a beat too long. He forced out the words, don't mistake silence for weakness. The meeting pressed on, but his mind wandered upstairs, where his daughter was fighting her own battles. Goldie had woken irritable that day, her small body weak from treatments. The nurse had stepped out to make a call. Left alone, she sat on her bed, restless, tugging at the knit cap that covered her thinning hair. The weight of it made her feel less like herself. Tears slipped down her cheeks, soft but steady, like the rain outside. Althea, who had been lingering quietly in the hallway, stepped in. She moved with a kind of gentleness that didn't draw attention to itself. She knelt by the bed, speaking softly. From her bag, she pulled a wig, a simple chestnut-colored piece, carefully wrapped. Let's try this, she murmured. She brushed a strand away from Goldie's forehead and adjusted the wig until it rested naturally. The child's sob slowed. Althea leaned close, whispering something only Goldie could hear. Whatever it was, it worked. Goldie's shoulders relaxed, and the corners of her mouth turned upward just a little. It wasn't a full smile yet, but it was more than the house had seen in months. Meanwhile, Sebastian, still locked in his meeting, clicked over to the hallway feed on his tablet. What he saw unsettled him. His daughter calm, almost content, and not because of him. A stranger had done what he couldn't. A stranger had eased his daughter's pain in moments. The knot in his chest pulled tighter. Victor's voice pulled him back. Sebastian, either you show us results or we show you the door. That's the reality. Family matters are fine, but they're not the company's burden. Sebastian's teeth clenched, but he didn't answer. He ended the call shortly after, rising from his chair with a heaviness that had nothing to do with the markets. That evening, he passed by Goldie's room. He froze when he heard it, a sound he had almost forgotten existed. Laughter. Soft, tentative, but real. He pushed the door open slightly. Goldie was curled against her pillows, the wig in place, giggling as Althea told her something in a low, playful voice. The sight should have comforted him. Instead, it stirred something jagged inside. He cleared his throat, stepping into the room. Don't overstep, he said sharply. Do the job you're paid for. Nothing more. Althea turned, her face calm, steady as stone. She nodded once, saying nothing. Sebastian left quickly, anger simmering beneath his skin. But as he reached the hallway, he caught it again, that small burst of laughter, light and warm, spilling into the empty corridor. It wasn't for him. It had never been for him. The rain had lifted by morning, leaving the yard damp and smelling faintly of pine. Sebastian walked through the hall with his phone in hand, already scanning messages from New York, when he paused at the open door of the sitting room. Inside, Goldie sat at a low table with a jar pulled from the kitchen shelf. A handful of wildflowers lay scattered on the cloth. Their stems were uneven, their petals a little wilted, but her face lit up as she touched each one. Althea knelt beside her, showing her how to trim the stems at an angle, how to lean taller blooms against shorter ones so they balanced. Goldie giggled when the flowers tipped sideways, water spilling a little on the table. It looks like a mess, she said. Althea laughed softly. Messy can still be beautiful. Sometimes the best things aren't perfect. Sebastian stayed frozen in the hallway. His daughter's smile, bright, alive, stung him more than it comforted. She hadn't laughed like that for him in months. Watching the two of them together, he felt something hollow open inside. It was the kind of ache he didn't admit even to himself, the fear that he was slowly being replaced in his own child's heart. He backed away before they noticed him, but the image clung to him the rest of the day. By afternoon, his phone began buzzing with alerts. A headline from a tabloid site shouted across the screen. Is Hale Global losing its grip? Sources claim CEO distracted by family drama. Within hours, business channels had picked it up. The story spun fast. Sebastian was no longer the sharp, unshakable mogul. He was the man slipping because of personal troubles. He didn't have to guess where it came from. Victor Drummond had been hinting at it for weeks, and Victor never wasted an opportunity to twist a knife. The next call with the board made it clear. They wanted proof of commitment, something solid, a major acquisition, a deal big enough to silence the doubts. "You built this company," one director said, "but you can't run it on memories. Show us you're still all in." Sebastian promised results, but the words felt thin, almost rehearsed. He ended the call and rubbed his temples, the pressure behind his eyes pounding like a drum. That evening, Dr. Evelyn Maris came by the house for Goldie's weekly check. She moved with the ease of someone who had known the family for years, greeting Sebastian with a nod before heading upstairs. Evelyn had been close to his late wife, which gave her a kind of authority he couldn't brush aside. He lingered near the doorway while she examined Goldie. The girl was tired but brighter than usual, chatting about the flowers she had arranged. Evelyn smiled, listening, then turned her attention to Sebastian. "She's responding to treatment," the doctor said, "but she needs more than medicine. She needs you, Sebastian. Not just the man signing checks. She needs her father." Her words landed heavier than any market report. He nodded stiffly, not trusting himself to answer. After the exam, Evelyn lingered in the kitchen with Althea. Their voices carried in low tones not meant for him, but he caught fragments while pouring himself another coffee. "I notice the way you calm her," Evelyn said gently. "It's not just care, it's familiarity. You've done this before." Althea hesitated. "My little sister," she admitted after a pause. "She had leukemia. I was the one who sat with her through most of it. She didn't make it." There was silence, then Evelyn's quiet reply. "That explains a lot." Sebastian's hand tightened around the mug. He hadn't expected to hear that, hadn't expected to feel a jolt of guilt and something else, maybe gratitude, that a stranger understood parts of Goldie's struggle better than he did. Althea's voice, steadier now, floated through the doorway. "I just don't want Goldie to feel as alone as my sister did." Sebastian stepped back before they noticed him. He carried the coffee upstairs, but when he entered his study the screen saver glowed at him, reflecting his own tired face. The headlines, the board's threats, Victor's smirk, they all pressed in. Yet what lingered more was the sound of Goldie laughing with flowers in her hands, and the knowledge that Althea's calm came from a loss deeper than he could fathom. The house felt different at night. The rain tapped steady on the roof, the hallways dim, the silence heavier than it should have been. Sebastian had been finishing reports in his study when he realized the clock had pushed past midnight. He rose to check on Goldie, a habit drilled into him more by worry than tenderness. Her door was cracked. He pushed it open quietly and froze. Goldie wasn't asleep. She was propped up on her pillows, eyes wide with interest. At the foot of her bed sat Althea, her voice low, telling some kind of story, something about her grandmother's porch in Georgia, the smell of rain on red dirt, fireflies blinking in the summer heat. Goldie laughed, soft and light. "Tell me more," she whispered, tugging at the blanket like she didn't want the moment to end. Sebastian stepped in sharply. "That's enough." His voice cut the room. Althea looked up, startled but calm. She couldn't sleep. "I was just—" "You're not here to play nursemaid or storyteller," he snapped. "Your job has limits. Stay within them." The words came out harsher than he intended, but before he could backtrack, Goldie's small voice rose, trembling with defiance. "I want her, not you." The sentence landed like a blow. Sebastian's chest tightened, his throat burning. He opened his mouth, but nothing came. Goldie turned away, hiding her face against the pillow, shutting him out. Althea didn't say a word. The silence between the three of them was louder than the rain outside. By morning, his temper had cooled, but the sting hadn't. He buried himself in work, arriving at Hale Global Ventures for meetings that stretched across the day. Victor Drummond wasted no time. "We need this merger," Victor said, pacing in front of the board. "Without it, the press will eat us alive. Investors want stability, not stories about a distracted CEO." Sebastian sat rigid at the table. I said I'd handle it. Victor leaned close, lowering his voice so only he could hear. Handle it fast. Prove you're still the man who built this empire, or you'll watch it slip away. Sebastian gave a curt nod. The message was clear. Choose the company or risk losing everything. And so he chose the company. When the nurse called to say Goldie was tired, asking if he could come home, he said no. When Althea sent a message saying Goldie was asking for him, he silenced the phone. The deal was his focus, but the choice carried its cost. That afternoon, Portland skies opened into a storm. Goldie slipped from her bed and wandered to the piano room. She pressed the keys, one by one, trying to play the piece her mother used to. Her fingers trembled. The sound broke uneven. Halfway through, her head swayed, her vision dimmed, and she collapsed onto the bench. Althea heard the fall and rushed in. Goldie. She caught the child in her arms, panic surging, but her movement steady. Without hesitation, she lifted her and carried her down the marble stairs, out into the rain, flagging down the driver to get them to St. Aurelia's Hospital. Meanwhile, in the boardroom, Sebastian sat across from Victor, defending his position. Numbers, projections, strategies filled the screen. Then his phone buzzed on the table. He glanced down, and the words drained the color from his face. Goldie collapsed. At hospital, Victor caught the flicker in his eyes. Family emergency? His tone dripped with mock concern. The timing couldn't be worse. Sebastian's hand tightened around the phone. He should have stood up, walked out, but he didn't. He stayed in the chair, the weight of the company chains keeping him there, every second stretching like punishment. At St. Aurelia's, Althea sat by Goldie's bedside, brushing damp curls from her forehead. When the girl stirred awake, her lips parted in a whisper. You feel more like my mom than anybody." The words pierced the air, innocent but sharp enough to wound. Althea froze, tears pressing at the corners of her eyes. She held the child's hand tighter, murmuring, "Rest now, sweet girl. I'm here." Later that night, when Sebastian finally arrived, the sight of his daughter asleep, clinging to Althea's hand, hit him harder than any insult Victor had thrown. The jealousy rose like bile, tangled with shame. He should have been the one there. He should have been the comfort. The storm had carried over into the next day, but inside Hale, Global Ventures the air was heavier than the weather outside. Sebastian walked through the glass doors of the headquarters, shoulders squared, his face locked into the mask he had perfected for decades. The lobby buzzed with muted whispers. Everyone had seen the headlines by now. The boardroom was waiting. Men and women in tailored suits sat around the long walnut table, the city skyline spreading out behind them like a backdrop for judgment. Victor Drummond stood near the head of the table, arms folded, lips curled in something close to satisfaction. "Let's not waste time," Victor began as soon as Sebastian took a seat. His voice carried the practiced rhythm of someone who knew exactly where to aim. "We all saw the news. Goldie Hale collapsed. She was carried into St. Aurelia's Hospital by your housekeeper." He tapped the stack of papers in front of him, then slid a glossy photo across the table. The picture showed Althea rushing through the hospital doors with Goldie limp in her arms, rain plastering her clothes to her body. The headline beside it read, "Housekeeper saves billionaire's daughter. Where was her father?" A murmur rippled through the room. Victor let it linger before speaking again. "Investors are asking questions. The press is circling. They want to know if Hale Global is being run by a man who can't even be there for his child." Sebastian's jaw tightened. "This is low even for you." Victor's smile was thin. "This isn't me, Sebastian. This is perception. And perception is reality in our business." The board members shifted in their chairs, eyes flicking between the two men. One director cleared his throat. "Sebastian, people are concerned. We need assurance that you're capable of steering this company. If you're distracted—" "I'm not distracted," Sebastian snapped, his voice louder than he intended. The room went silent. He leaned forward, forcing steadiness into his tone. "What happened was a private matter. It has no bearing on this company's direction." Victor spread his hands in mock innocence. Then explain why your daughter's crisis made the front page while your absence was the headline. The silence that followed was worse than argument. Sebastian could feel the ground slipping, the authority he'd always wielded now teetering. He wanted to rage, to accuse Victor outright of planting the story, but he knew the photographs spoke louder than denials. And deep down, beneath all his defenses, he felt the truth pressing in. He hadn't been there when Goldie needed him most. Sebastian left the boardroom not as the man who controlled the narrative, but as a man who had lost it. When he returned home that evening, the manor felt more like a stranger's house than his own. He found Althea in the kitchen, rinsing out Goldie's water cup. She turned when she heard him, but her expression stayed neutral. "You enjoyed your moment, didn't you?" Sebastian said, his voice sharp, carrying her into that hospital like some hero. "The cameras just happened to be there? Convenient." Althea dried her hands calmly. "You think I wanted that? That I was looking for cameras while she was burning up in my arms?" "You let them capture it," he accused. "Now the world thinks you saved her. And I—" Her voice cut in, steady and unwavering. "I don't care what the world thinks. I care that she's still breathing." Sebastian froze. No one spoke to him like that. Not employees, not partners, not anyone. But Althea's gaze didn't waver, and for a moment he had no retort. Her words lingered long after she left the room. He poured himself a drink he didn't touch, staring at the glass until the ice melted. He told himself she had overstepped, that she didn't understand the pressures he carried. But the truth gnawed at him. She had been there when he hadn't. It was a fact he couldn't twist or bury, no matter how much he wanted to. And that made the silence in Halecrest Manor feel sharper than any headline could. The ballroom at Hale Global's downtown tower gleamed like it had been scrubbed for royalty. Marble floors shone, so bright they seemed to reflect every flash from the reporters' cameras. Chandeliers swayed slightly overhead, their lights spilling down on executives and shareholders packed into rows of polished chairs. This was supposed to be Sebastian Hale's triumph, a carefully staged signing ceremony meant to silence doubters, reassure investors, and remind the world he was still in control. He stood at the podium in a navy suit, his tie knotted to perfection, his jaw locked tight. On his left sat the CEO of the rival media conglomerate, smiling wide for the press, as though the deal were already sealed. The board members behind them wore expressions of cautious relief. They wanted this merger like oxygen. They wanted proof that their billionaire figurehead wasn't too distracted by his personal life to steer the company forward. Sebastian had rehearsed the lines in his head: synergy, future growth, solidifying our global reach. He said them now, with practiced ease, each phrase crisp, each pause calculated. For a few minutes, it seemed to work. Cameras clicked politely, pen scribbled. And then it happened. "Mr. Hale," a voice rang out from the back, sharp and unshaken. A young reporter stood with a microphone, ignoring the ushers trying to hush him. "How can you claim you're fit to lead this merger when your own daughter was rushed to the hospital, carried not by you, but by your housekeeper?" The question sliced through the ballroom like glass breaking. For a beat, silence. Then the chaos came. Reporters shouting follow-ups, cameras firing like gunshots, the crowd rippling with murmurs. Sebastian froze. His throat went dry. He forced his lips to move. "This event is about the future of Hale Global," he said, the words stiff and hollow. But the damage was done. On every screen in the room, live broadcasts ran with the headline already scrolling: "Absent father, failing CEO." The partner CEO leaned in, his smile gone. "We can't be tied to this storm," he muttered under his breath. Within minutes, aides were scrambling, papers were pulled from the table, and the merger collapsed right there under the chandeliers. Board members slipped out, avoiding Sebastian's eyes. Some shook Victor Drummond's hand on their way, the gesture subtle but clear. Victor himself lingered, arms folded, lips curved in the faintest smirk, as if he'd been waiting for this moment all along. By the time Sebastian returned to Halecrest Manor, the story was everywhere. His phone buzzed with unanswered calls, notifications streaming in like relentless waves. But nothing hit him harder than what waited upstairs. Goldie sat on her bed, knees pulled to her chest, her tablet glowing in her lap. The article headline stared up at him, bold and merciless. Her eyes, red and wet, lifted to meet his. "I wish Mom was here," she said, her little voice trembling but clear. "She would never have left me to go sign papers." The words gutted him. He stepped forward, desperate to close the distance. "Goldie, that's not fair. I wasn't leaving you. I was doing what I thought." "You always think about the company first," she cried, dropping the tablet onto the blanket. "You never think about me." He reached to touch her shoulder, but she twisted away, burying her face against the pillow. The rejection stung more than any headline or corporate betrayal. He stood there useless, listening to her muffled sobs until they quieted into the heavy rhythm of exhausted sleep. Later that night, the house was silent but for the rain tapping at the tall windows. Sebastian sat in his study, a glass of scotch untouched by his elbow. His eyes lingered on the framed photograph of his wife, taken years ago when life had been easier. She was laughing, holding Goldie as a baby, sunlight streaming in behind them. "What have I turned into?" he whispered. His own voice startled him. A CEO who can't hold a company, a father who can't hold his daughter. He leaned back in the chair, shoulders sagging, the weight of failure pressing against his chest. The mask he wore in boardrooms, at galas, even at Goldie's bedside, had cracked. All that remained was a man who didn't know how to fix the pieces. The door creaked open. Althea stepped in quietly, almost hesitant. She held something small in her hand, folded and worn with use. Without a word, she placed it on the desk before him. A soft handkerchief with embroidered edges, faintly smelling of lavender. He knew it instantly. Goldie's. She clutched it when the nights were long and the fevers rose too high. Althea's voice was steady, not unkind, but firm. "You can lose everything else, Mr. Hale. The company, the headlines, even the people who think they matter." She paused, eyes steady on his. "But don't lose her. Don't let that be the thing you throw away." Sebastian stared at the handkerchief, the fabric glowing under the lamplight. His chest tightened, words stuck in his throat. For once, he had nothing to argue with. Althea turned and left, her footsteps fading down the hallway. The study fell back into silence. Sebastian sat there, the handkerchief resting on the desk like a verdict. He realized, with a clarity sharper than anything that had come in months, that he was standing at a crossroad. One path clung to power, to ego, to the company he'd built. The other led somewhere he had no map for, toward learning, maybe too late, how to truly be a father. The days after the failed merger dragged like lead. The house seemed darker even in daylight, as though the sunlight itself had decided to skip over Halecrest. Sebastian spent most of his hours shut inside his study, papers scattered across the desk, though he barely read a word. His tie hung loose, his once perfect posture slouched. He let the calls go unanswered, the emails pile up. The world outside could rage and burn, it already had. What haunted him most was the echo of his daughter's words, "I wish Mom was here." They played on repeat every time he closed his eyes. He poured himself into silence instead, a silence so thick that even Goldie stopped knocking on his door. But Althea would not sit idle. She noticed the pallor in Goldie's cheeks, the way her steps grew slower each morning, the spark dimming behind her bright eyes. She knew the walls of this mansion, for all their grandeur, were choking the child. So one late morning, when the nurses left and the halls were still, Althea coaxed Goldie into a cardigan and sneakers. "Where are we going?" Goldie asked, her voice thin but curious. "Someplace with real air," Althea said with a small smile. "You'll see." They slipped out, driver in tow, and ended up at the Lark's Nest, a modest cafe tucked on a quiet corner of town. The windows were wide open, letting the smell of coffee and baked bread float into the street. Inside, mismatched chairs crowded around wooden tables, walls lined with chalkboard menus and local art. It was warm, noisy in a way that felt alive. Goldie perched on a stool, her eyes wide as she watched baristas call orders, laughter bounce between tables, a baby crying in the corner. It was a world entirely different from the curated silence of Halecrest. "You worked here?" Goldie tilted her head at Althea. For a long time, Althea nodded. This place saved me in a way, kept me grounded. Customers greeted her with familiarity. A waitress waved from across the room. An older man in an apron clapped her shoulder with a "good to see you back, Althea." Goldie blinked, surprised. She had always thought of Althea as belonging to their house, her world defined by caretaking. But here, Althea was someone else, known, valued, loved. Then the door swung open, and a man stepped in. His presence cut through the chatter. Tall, with the same dark eyes as Althea, though sharper, his jaw tight. He spotted them instantly. "Althea," he said, voice low but carrying. "I should have known you'd be here." She stiffened. "Malcolm," she answered carefully, standing from her seat. Goldie blinked between them. "Is he?" "My brother," Althea murmured. Malcolm didn't bother with pleasantries. "You said you were keeping your distance from their kind. And now here you are, dragging a sick kid into a cafe like this." His gaze flicked toward Goldie, then back at his sister. "You really think those people will protect you? They'll use you until you're nothing." Althea's face flushed. "It's not like that. You don't understand." "I understand enough," Malcolm said, his tone cutting. "Rich houses chew people up. Mom lived that truth. And now you're volunteering for the same fate." Goldie's hands tightened around the ceramic mug in front of her. She hadn't meant to listen, but the words pierced straight through. Used. Chewed up. She glanced at Althea, a flicker of doubt rising in her chest. For months she had trusted this woman without question. Now just for a second, the ground beneath that trust wobbled. Althea noticed, and her heart sank. She touched Goldie's arm lightly. "Don't listen to him. He's angry at me, not at you." But Goldie didn't answer. She only stared at her drink, shoulders small and stiff. By the time they returned to Halecrest, the damage was already rippling. Sebastian was waiting in the foyer, his expression stormy. "You took her out?" His voice was low, but trembling with restrained fury. "Without telling me?" Althea kept her chin steady. She needed fresh air. She needed to feel alive again. "That's not your decision to make," Sebastian snapped. "You don't get to parade her around town like some charity project." Althea's lips parted, ready to defend herself, but then she caught sight of Goldie, quiet, withdrawn, not meeting her eyes. The child who usually jumped to her defense now stood mute, caught in the undertow of doubt. Sebastian saw it too, and for once, instead of feeling triumphant, he felt a pang of unease. Something had shifted between the three of them. Goldie's silence wasn't relief or loyalty, it was distance. And distance, Sebastian knew, was far harder to bridge than anger. That night, long after the house had settled, Sebastian sat alone in the study again. He should have felt justified in his anger, but instead, all he felt was the cold chill of uncertainty. Althea's choices unsettled him, but Goldie's silence unsettled him more. For the first time, he wasn't sure who his daughter believed in anymore, or if she believed in anyone at all. The house felt heavier than usual, as though the air itself had turned stale. Goldie, once the heartbeat of Halecrest with her soft laughter and sudden bursts of curiosity, now moved like a shadow through its halls. She spoke less, ate less, and even when Althea tried to coax a smile with small gestures, reading her favorite book or braiding her hair, the little girl turned her face away. It wasn't anger, not quite. It was distance. Sebastian noticed it every time he walked into the room. There was a new silence, not the quiet of rest, but of retreat. And the more he watched, the more it pressed against his chest, until he had to step out to breathe. He had once blamed Althea for stealing Goldie's affection, but now, watching his daughter avoid her, he realized it wasn't about rivalry anymore. Something deeper was breaking. At the same time, the corporate world closed in on him. Victor Drummond moved like a predator, sensing blood. In a boardroom stripped warmth, with its glass walls and relentless fluorescent lights, Victor leaned across the table one afternoon and lowered his voice just enough for only Sebastian to hear. "There's a way to salvage this," Victor said smoothly. "Step down as CEO in name. You'll still hold shares, still enjoy the perks. I'll take the public blows, manage the press, rebuild the image. You'll remain untouched." Sebastian narrowed his eyes. And what's the catch? Victor smiled as if it were obvious. Distance yourself from the help. End this spectacle of having your maid paraded as some sort of surrogate mother. The public loves a scandal, Sebastian. They'll chew on it until nothing's left. Cut her loose. It protects your family's image, and frankly, it's the only chance you've got left. The words landed heavier than any accusation. For a moment, Sebastian imagined saying yes. Imagined reclaiming some sliver of authority, appearing dignified again, letting the world believe he still had control. But the picture soured when he thought of Goldie, fragile, clutching at something he couldn't give her, something only Althea seemed able to provide. He left the meeting with Victor's words echoing like chains rattling around his mind. Every step through the marble lobby, every nod from employees who looked at him with veiled pity, reminded him how precarious everything had become. That evening, he sat in Goldie's room. The curtains were drawn against the drizzle outside. A lamp glowed softly, illuminating the stuffed animals lined neatly on her shelf, the piano books stacked in a corner. Goldie lay curled on her side, staring at nothing. For a long while, he didn't know what to say. He had spent years commanding boardrooms, persuading investors, silencing critics. Yet here, with his daughter's small hand resting limply on the blanket, words failed him. Finally, he asked the simplest thing. "Goldie," he whispered, his voice more fragile than he'd intended, "what do you want?" She blinked, slowly turning her face toward him. Her lips parted, and for a moment he feared silence again. But then she spoke, so softly he almost missed it. "I don't want anyone to leave me. Not anymore." Her words struck deeper than any headline, deeper than Victor's barbs. They pulled him back to the night his wife slipped away, her hand growing cold in his even as he begged her to fight. He remembered the helplessness, the rage at being unable to stop it. And now here was his daughter, pleading for what he had already failed to give once before, someone who stayed. Sebastian's throat tightened. He wanted to promise her, to swear he would never walk away, but he knew promises meant little if actions betrayed them. If he chose Victor's deal, he would be repeating the same abandonment, cloaked this time in business suits and polished lies. He reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I've made you feel like you're alone, and you're not. Not as long as I'm breathing." Goldie's eyes glistened, but she said nothing. Still, the faint squeeze of her hand against his was enough to remind him she hadn't given up on him entirely. Later that night, Sebastian stood by the tall windows of his study, watching rain streak down the glass. The city lights beyond blurred, refracted through the storm. His reflection stared back, tired, lined, no longer the man who had built empires with unshakable confidence. He wasn't sure if that man even existed anymore. But maybe that was the point. Maybe the man his daughter needed wasn't the CEO of Hale Global Ventures. Maybe it was simply her father, present and unflinching. Behind him, the silence of the house pressed in again. The decision loomed, enormous and inevitable. On one side lay the company, his life's work, the fortress of his identity. On the other lay the fragile heart of his daughter, still beating, still hoping he would not abandon her like fate had already done once before. He closed his eyes, Victor's ultimatum whispering like a serpent in his ear. "Cut her loose. Save your name." And yet, Goldie's plea lingered louder. "Don't leave me." Sebastian opened his eyes to the storm, realizing the next step would define not just his career, but the kind of father he would be remembered as. The rain drummed harder against the glass as though urging him forward, but no answer came yet. Only the weight of the question hung in the air. Would he choose the hollow security of power or the fragile truth of family? Sebastian barely slept after the conversation with Goldie. Her words, so simple, so fragile, echoed through every corner of his mind. He had built his life on certainty, numbers, contracts, strategies. Yet nothing about this felt calculable. The empire he had forged was slipping from his grasp, but what terrified him most was the quiet distance in his daughter's eyes. He had already lost his wife to an illness he could not cure. He had already sacrificed warmth for ambition. Now he was teetering on the edge of losing Goldie's trust as well. Sitting alone in his office before dawn, Sebastian stared at the city skyline. He thought about the choices that had carried him here. The endless meetings. The deals struck in rooms that smelled of polished wood and cold ambition. The applause when profit soared. None of it had prepared him for this. The look on his little girl's face when she asked him not to leave her. He questioned himself. Was the chase for power worth the hollow house? Did titles and wealth mean anything if, at the end of the day, he was just a man sitting in silence, too afraid to reach for the one person who needed him most? The doubt gnawed at him, louder than Victor's threats, louder than the market reports on his desk. By mid-morning, the storm he feared arrived. Victor Drummond summoned the board to an emergency session. The air in the conference room was thick, not with formality, but with hunger. Directors leaning forward, their eyes gleaming at the spectacle. Victor stood with the ease of a man who believed the battle already won. Sebastian Hale, Victor declared, voice sharp enough to cut glass, is no longer fit to lead Hale Global Ventures. His absence at critical junctures, his negligence, his personal distractions, they've all led us here. The company cannot survive under his hand. Sebastian sat motionless, jaw tight, but Victor wasn't finished. He lifted a stack of glossy magazines and tossed them onto the table. Headlines screamed from every cover. One read, "Billionaire's empire crumbles under weight of sick child." Another, "Where was Sebastian Hale when his daughter collapsed?" The words that froze the room, however, came from a front-page spread. "The billionaire's daughter has become the burden shaking the empire." Victor's eyes lingered on Sebastian, savoring the sting. Even the public sees it now. Your daughter has become the symbol of your failure. The fury that surged through Sebastian was volcanic. Not because Victor questioned his leadership, he had endured critics before, but because his little girl, innocent and fragile, was being dragged into the arena. He wanted to leap across the table, to silence Victor with his fists, but the weight of despair pinned him down. He couldn't protect Goldie from this. By the time he reached home, the damage had already spread. Goldie was on the couch, a tablet clutched in her trembling hands. Her face was pale, her cheeks wet with tears. She turned toward him, eyes wide and wounded. "Daddy," she sobbed, voice breaking, "why do they hate me? What did I do wrong?" Sebastian's throat closed. He opened his mouth, but no words came. How could he tell her the truth, that the cruelty of adults had nothing to do with her, that she was simply caught in the crossfire of power and pride? Instead, he sank down beside her and pulled her into his arms, holding her as if he could shield her from the world. But his embrace felt like a flimsy barrier against the storm raging outside. Althea stood quietly in the doorway. She had seen enough to know when to step in. Moving closer, she crouched beside Goldie, reaching out a hand. "Sweetheart, none of this is your fault. People can be cruel when they're scared. Don't listen to them." But before she could finish, Sebastian's voice sliced through the room, raw and jagged. "Stay out of this, Althea. This isn't your place." Althea froze. Goldie jerked her head up, shocked. "You don't understand," Sebastian continued, his anger spilling over. "You're just the help. Don't meddle in things you don't belong in." The words hung in the air, sharp and merciless. For a moment, even he was stunned by the venom in his own voice. Goldie's eyes widened, not in fear, but in fury. She pushed away from him, her small hands balled into fists. "Don't talk to her like that. She cares about me more than you do." "Goldie," Sebastian tried, his voice cracking. But she wasn't finished. The cry that burst out of her cut through the room, like lightning. "I wish she was my family instead of you." The silence that followed was unbearable. Sebastian felt the ground tilt beneath him, as though her words had torn open a chasm inside his chest. His daughter's rejection, so raw and absolute, was more devastating than any defeat in the boardroom. He had faced rivals, scandals, betrayals, but nothing had ever broken him like this. The night after the shouting match was heavy with silence. Sebastian paced the hallway outside Goldie's room, guilt still burning in his chest. Every word replayed in his mind like a hammer. "I wish she was my family instead of you." He pressed his hands against his temples, trying to block it out, but the house itself seemed to echo her voice. Close to midnight, A sudden cry broke through the stillness. Sebastian rushed into Goldie's room and found her trembling, her skin flushed red, sweat soaking the sheets. She was burning with fever. "Goldie," he gasped, kneeling at her bedside. His hands shook as he tried to feel her forehead, to figure out what to do. "Oh God, you're burning up." His mind went blank. He reached for his phone, fumbling to call the doctor, but the panic made his fingers clumsy. He barked into the phone. "Get here now, please. It's my daughter. She's not well. Hurry." Behind him, Althea appeared at the doorway, hair tied back, eyes clear. She crossed the room in 2 quick strides and took control. "Give me a bowl of cool water and some towels," she said firmly, her voice calm but steady. Sebastian froze. "I what?" "Now, Mr. Hale," she said, already lifting Goldie gently into her arms. "We need to keep her temperature down until the doctor comes." Her certainty jolted him into motion. He ran, grabbed the towels, and stumbled back with the bowl, nearly spilling the water. Althea didn't flinch. She wrung out the cloth and began dabbing Goldie's forehead, humming low under her breath. Her hands moved with practiced care, not frantic, not unsure, just steady. Sebastian stood there, useless, watching the way Goldie's breathing began to slow under Althea's touch. His chest tightened. Everything he should have known how to do, everything a father should be capable of, she was doing it. And she wasn't even his blood. By the time Dr. Evelyn Maris arrived, Althea had Goldie propped up, a damp towel laid across her brow. The doctor moved quickly, checking vitals, murmuring instructions. Sebastian hovered, desperate for direction, but it was Althea who answered with precision. Then, as Dr. Maris gathered her equipment, Sebastian heard it. Althea's voice lowered, strained with memory. "She used to get fevers like this," Althea whispered, almost to herself. "My little sister, but that time I couldn't save her." Sebastian froze mid-step. He turned, staring at Althea, who had her hand resting on Goldie's arm. The words hit him like a blow. He had never heard her speak of family, never seen her let the mask slip. The doctor gave a soft, sympathetic nod, placing a hand briefly on Althea's shoulder before continuing her work. Sebastian's world tilted. He understood, suddenly, why Althea never flinched at Goldie's worst nights, why her patience seemed bottomless, why she could face his anger without breaking. She wasn't just a servant stepping out of line. She was a woman carrying grief so deep it had carved her into someone stronger. When the doctor finally reassured them that Goldie would be fine with rest and care, Sebastian sat in the corner, silent. Althea settled into the chair beside the bed, softly humming a lullaby. It was an old tune, one that seemed to carry weight, like it had been sung in 1,000 kitchens and bedrooms before this one. Goldie stirred, eyes half open. "Stay, please," she murmured, voice faint. "I'm right here," Althea whispered, smoothing her hair back. Sebastian watched, every defense inside him breaking down. For so long, he had seen Althea as a threat to his authority, someone trespassing into places he thought belonged to him alone. But now, watching her cradle his daughter's fear as if it were her own, he didn't see replacement. He saw redemption. His chest ached with something that felt dangerously close to relief. For years, he had carried the weight of being untouchable. But here, in the dim light of his daughter's room, he saw what he had missed all along. Family isn't bound by blood or nameplates on doors. Family is made of the people who stay when you are weakest. Althea's song faded into silence. Goldie's breathing evened out, her fever breaking. Sebastian leaned forward, his throat raw. "Althea," he said hoarsely, his voice trembling with something he couldn't hide anymore. She looked up, surprised by the vulnerability in his tone. He swallowed hard, every word scraping against pride and fear. "If you leave us, we'll have nothing left." The confession hung between them, fragile, but it was the first truth he had spoken in years that carried no calculation, no armor. Just a father, stripped bare, finally admitting that the walls he built around himself had kept out the very thing he needed most. The morning after Goldie's fever had broken, the house was quiet, but the silence no longer felt like rest. It felt like a storm waiting outside the door. Newspapers and online outlets were already buzzing with headlines, most of them cruel. Billionaire's daughter fights for life while father absent again. The photographs were worse. Images of ambulances parked near the Hale estate. Shots of Goldie's pale face caught through tinted car windows. Sebastian sat at the long dining table with the paper folded in his hands, his jaw locked. Every word seemed designed to carve deeper into his failures. He could feel the eyes of the staff who slipped quietly in and out of the room, avoiding his gaze. They had seen the headlines too. By mid-morning, his phone wouldn't stop buzzing. The board of directors had called for an emergency meeting downtown. Victor had wasted no time. When Sebastian arrived at Hale Global Ventures, the boardroom air was already thick with tension. Men and women in sharp suits sat around the table, their expressions caught somewhere between pity and calculation. At the head of table stood Victor Drummond, perfectly composed, his voice carrying as soon as Sebastian entered. "Sebastian," Victor said smoothly, "I wish this weren't necessary. But the situation has spiraled. Public trust is collapsing. The company can't endure this level of scrutiny." Sebastian took a seat, his fingers tapping once against the polished wood before going still. "Get to the point." Victor slid a folder across the table. "This is a resolution to transfer your executive authority. You'll retain your shares, of course. Think of it as protecting your legacy while I steer the company out of crisis." His smile was thin. "You sign, and the media storm settles. You refuse, well, they'll start digging deeper into things you don't want exposed. Like who's really caring for your daughter." The words hung in the air. Everyone knew what he meant. Althea. Sebastian felt a muscle in his jaw twitch. He glanced at the document, the letters swimming in front of him. This was what Victor had been circling for months, maybe years. Using his weakest point, his family, as leverage. He thought of Goldie, curled under the blankets last night, whispering she didn't want anyone to leave her. He thought of Althea, her steady hands cooling a fever he hadn't known how to fight. Victor leaned closer, his voice lower, but sharp enough to cut. "Sebastian, you've already lost the public. Don't lose the company too. Sign it, and we keep your private arrangements off the record. Otherwise, Althea's name becomes tomorrow's headline." The board members shifted uncomfortably. A few cleared their throats, others avoided eye contact. Everyone was waiting for him to fold. Sebastian picked up the pen. His hand trembled, but not from fear. This time it was fury. He stared at the signature line, then slowly, deliberately set the pen down. Without another word, he lifted the document in both hands and tore it straight down the middle. The rip echoed through the room, louder than any speech he could have made. Victor's smile evaporated. "What the hell are you doing?" Sebastian's voice was steady, almost frightening in its calm. "If this company can only survive by erasing the truth about my family, then it isn't worth a damn. I will not sign away my daughter's dignity, or the woman who saved her, to keep these walls standing." The room was silent. Shock held them still. Even the air conditioner seemed to hush. Victor's face hardened, his mask cracking just enough to reveal the venom underneath. "You just signed the death certificate for your career, Sebastian, and I will be the one to lower it into the ground." Sebastian pushed back his chair and stood. "Better that than burying the last shred of my humanity." He walked out, leaving the shredded papers scattered like fallen leaves across the table. By the time he reached the lobby, news had already broken. Somehow, word of the confrontation had slipped to the press. Screens in the building lobby flashed with breaking headlines. "Sebastian Hale refuses to relinquish control. Company in chaos." Talk shows called him reckless. Online pundits branded him unstable. But when he returned home that evening, the house felt different. Goldie was waiting at the top of the staircase, still pale, but with a spark in her eyes he hadn't seen in months. "Dad," she said softly. He climbed the stairs, his chest heavy with everything he had risked, everything he might still lose. "Yes, sweetheart." Her voice trembled, but it carried a quiet strength. "You didn't leave this time. You stayed." Sebastian swallowed hard, blinking back a sting he didn't want her to see. He crouched down so he could meet her eyes. "I did," he whispered. The storm broke on a Thursday morning. By noon, every major news channel was tuned in to Victor Drummond's press conference. Cameras lined the stage where he stood, a man perfectly at ease under harsh lights, with a rehearsed smirk curling his lips. He raised a folder thick with papers and photographs, like a prosecutor ready to deliver a verdict. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victor began, his voice smooth as polished steel. "For months we've watched Sebastian Hale lose control of his company, of his judgment, and of his own household. Today, the truth must be laid bare." He held up a grainy photo of Althea walking with Goldie outside the Lark's Nest Cafe. "This is Althea Brooks, a woman with no professional qualifications, no stable history. She has jumped from job to job, leaving behind unanswered questions. And now she has positioned herself in the most intimate corners of the Hale family. Is this loyalty? Or is it opportunism dressed as compassion?" The room erupted with murmurs, cameras flashing like fireworks. Watching the broadcast from home, Goldie's hands clenched into fists. She sat on the couch, her eyes glassy. "They're lying about her," she whispered, her voice breaking. Althea sat beside her, frozen, her face pale, but her jaw tight, carrying the silence like a shield she didn't know how much longer she could hold. At the conference, Victor leaned closer to the microphones. "We are not dealing with a caretaker. We are dealing with a manipulator who has taken advantage of a vulnerable child for her own gain." The words sliced through Goldie. She turned to Althea, tears brimming. "Why are they saying this about you? Did you do something wrong?" Her voice trembled with the desperate confusion of a child forced to carry shame that wasn't hers. Althea shook her head quickly, cupping Goldie's cheek. "No, sweetheart. No. People twist stories when they're afraid of the truth. That's all this is." But her voice cracked, betraying the weight of scars she had carried long before she stepped into this house. Back at the conference, reporters crowded Victor with questions, the energy shifting toward frenzy, until the back doors of the hall opened. Heads turned. Sebastian Hale walked in. He looked older than he had weeks ago, his suit slightly rumpled, but there was something unshakable in his step. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Cameras swiveled. Victor's smile faltered. Sebastian didn't wait to be invited. He strode straight to the podium, brushing past Victor, who tried to intercept him. The microphones caught the scrape of his breath as he leaned forward. "You've heard a lot of words this morning," Sebastian began, his voice carrying a raw edge that wasn't rehearsed. "But let me tell you what's true." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the reporters. "The woman you're calling an opportunist is the one who kept my daughter alive when I didn't know how. She is the one who stayed when every headline told her to run. She is not a burden to this family. She is family." The silence that followed was heavier than the noise before it. It landed like a stone in water, rippling out. Cameras clicked furiously, desperate to capture his defiance. Victor tried to interject, his voice sharp. "Sebastian, you're jeopardizing everything. This is sentiment, not strategy." But Sebastian cut him off, his tone rising. "Strategy didn't wipe my daughter's forehead when she burned with fever. Strategy didn't sing her to sleep when she cried for a mother she'll never see again. Althea did. And if you want to call that manipulation, then you've forgotten what it means to be human." The room erupted. Some reporters shouting questions, others stunned into silence. Victor's composure cracked. He slammed the folder shut, his jaw tight, and stepped back from the podium. Somewhere in the chaos, Althea slipped into the back of the room. Her eyes were red, her hand pressed over her mouth as she listened to Sebastian's voice echoing through the microphones. After the press conference, in the quiet of his estate, she faced him with tears spilling freely. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered. "You've already lost so much. You don't need to risk the rest because of me." Sebastian shook his head, his eyes unwavering. "I once lost the woman I loved because I was too afraid to stay. I told myself duty mattered more. I was wrong then. I won't be wrong again." His voice cracked, but his certainty didn't. Althea's tears fell harder, but there was a softness in them now, not shame. Goldie, unable to hold back, ran into both of them, her arms clutching their waists, sobbing so hard her whole body shook. Don't let them take you away, she cried. I don't care about what they say. I just want you here. Sebastian wrapped an arm around his daughter, the other around Althea, drawing them both close. The house didn't feel like a fortress or a prison. It felt like a home. But the reprieve was short. As they pulled apart, the sound of Victor's voice lingered in Sebastian's head. His rival had stormed out of the press hall, turning once to throw his final dagger. You'll regret this, Hale. Choosing heart over reason will ruin you. Sebastian had watched him go, the chill of those words settling like ice. Now, standing with Goldie and Althea in his arms, he knew Victor wasn't finished. The battle ahead would be brutal. And yet, Sebastian felt something stronger than fear. He felt clarity. Family wasn't his weakness anymore. It was his anchor. By the morning after the press conference, the country was split down the middle. Talk shows couldn't get enough of the spectacle. Some called Sebastian Hale a broken man blinded by sentiment, a once great leader unraveling in public. Others called him a father finally finding his soul, praising his willingness to sacrifice prestige for love. But while television debates raged, the company's boardroom bled. Investors withdrew, shares sank, and headlines declared Hale Global Ventures on the verge of collapse. The empire he had built with a lifetime of calculation was dissolving in weeks. Victor knew exactly how to play this moment. That evening, as rain hammered against the tall windows of Halecrest Manor, the estate felt heavier than ever. Sebastian sat in his study, the fire glowing but offering little warmth. The storm outside seemed to echo the storm in his chest. The doorbell cut through the sound of thunder. When the butler announced Victor Drummond, Sebastian felt no surprise. He knew this confrontation was coming. Victor entered with the confidence of a man who had already won. His coat dripped water onto the polished floor, but he didn't bother shaking it off. He placed a leather folder on the desk with a deliberate thud. Sebastian, Victor said, his tone falsely cordial, I'll make this simple. Sign this, and your name remains intact. No more scandals. No more headlines. You step aside with dignity, and I'll manage the rest. Sebastian glanced at the folder. The weight of the papers felt heavier than their physical form. And if I don't, he asked quietly. Victor leaned in, lowering his voice like a knife sliding between ribs. Then I release everything. Not just about you. About her. He tilted his chin toward the hall, where Althea's voice had been heard earlier, reading softly to Goldie. Every job she lost, every desperate move she made, every trace of her past. The media will eat her alive. She won't get another chance in this city or anywhere else. Sebastian's jaw tightened. Rage simmered in his chest, but under it was fear. Fear that his choice, meant to protect, could instead destroy the woman who had given his daughter hope. He turned away, staring into the fire as the flames blurred. Victor saw the hesitation and pressed harder. Think about it. You're already finished. But she doesn't have to be. Save her, Sebastian. Sign. The study was silent except for the rain. Sebastian's hands curled into fists on the armrests of his chair. For years, he had lived by the creed of preserving power, of bargaining survival at any cost. That old instinct whispered now, sign, protect her, keep what you can. He almost wavered. But then, a small sound stirred behind the doorway. Goldie's footsteps, soft against the floor. She had been listening. Her small figure emerged from the shadows, eyes wide but steady. She walked straight to Althea, who had followed her, and clasped her hand tightly. Facing Victor, Goldie lifted her chin with a trembling kind of courage. If you're trying to destroy someone just because they love me, she said, her voice cracking yet strong, then you're the one who's already lost. The room went utterly still. Victor blinked, caught off guard by the child's words. Althea's hand flew to her mouth, tears springing unbidden. Sebastian rose slowly from his chair. Something in his daughter's defiance snapped the last chain, holding him back. His voice came low, but steady, stronger with each word. You hear that, Victor? Out of the mouths of children comes more truth than you'll ever speak. He stepped around the desk, facing the man who had shadowed him for decades. I will not sign. You can burn my name, strip my company, Ruin my career. Do it. But you will not lay a finger on my family. Not anymore. Victor's smirk faltered. For the first time, it was clear he hadn't expected defiance this absolute. The rain outside pounded harder, like applause against the windows. Althea clutched Goldie's shoulders, her own tears sliding freely now. Sebastian's eyes flicked to them, two people who had become his compass when his world turned upside down, and he felt something new settle inside him. A clarity sharper than fear, stronger than pride. Victor gathered his folder, lips pressed thin. You think this is noble, he spat. It's reckless. You'll regret it. Maybe, Sebastian replied. But at least I'll regret it's standing on the right side. Victor turned on his heel, his footsteps echoing through the hall as he left the manor, his shadow stretching long in the firelight. When the door shut, silence filled the study again. But it was no longer the silence of fear. It was the kind that came after chains broke. Goldie squeezed Althea's hand tighter, then looked up at her father with wet eyes. You didn't let him win, she whispered. Sebastian knelt, drawing her into his arms. No, sweetheart. Not this time. Victor struck back harder than ever. Within 48 hours, every major network and newspaper carried a headline dripping with his fingerprints. Sebastian Hale unfit to lead. The nanny who manipulated a billionaire. Commentators tore apart Althea's past, painting her as a cunning opportunist who had built sympathy on tragedy. Talk radio hosts called her a fraud. Gossip magazines dredged up old addresses and jobs she had left behind. It was a storm meant to drown them all. The effect was immediate. Strangers spat venom online, and the manor's front gates filled with photographers. Goldie woke to see her friend's name smeared across tabloids. Althea tried to hide her tears, but the weight of those lies bent her shoulders. Sebastian watched all this unfold and realized silence would only be another betrayal. For most of his life, he had believed power meant controlling the narrative, keeping feelings locked behind polished glass. But now, with his daughter's trust and Althea's dignity on the line, he saw that the only path forward was honesty. So he made a choice. When the networks came calling for comment, Sebastian didn't release a statement through lawyers or PR. He agreed to a live interview, unedited, on national television. The announcement itself was enough to ignite debate. Some expected a desperate man grasping for relevance, others a last gasp before disgrace. The night of the broadcast, the studio lights burned hot against his skin. Across from him sat a seasoned anchor, her eyes sharp but not unkind. Millions were watching, waiting for him to crumble or spin. Instead, Sebastian began with no notes, no defense. Just his voice. I was married to a woman named Catherine, he said softly. She was the heart of this house. When cancer took her, I told myself burying the grief in work would keep me afloat. I was wrong. All I did was leave my daughter to grow up in silence, in a home that felt more like a museum than a family. The anchor let him continue. His words hung in the air, raw and unpolished. When Goldie got sick, I froze. I didn't know how to hold her pain. I thought money could build walls strong enough to keep her safe. But it couldn't. And in those moments, when I failed the most, someone else stepped in. Not for wealth, not for gain. She stepped in because she refused to walk away. He turned slightly toward the camera. Her name is Althea. She is not a servant. She is not an opportunist. She is the woman who stayed when I had no courage left. And for that, she is a member of my family, the Hale family. Backstage, Althea covered her mouth with trembling hands. Goldie squeezed her arm, wide-eyed but glowing with pride. The anchor paused, visibly moved before asking, Mr. Hale, you realize this may cost you your company. Sebastian nodded. It already has. But companies can be rebuilt. A child's trust cannot. A family cannot. The interview spread like wildfire. Some critics sneered, calling it a performance. But others, parents who had sat sleepless beside hospital beds, widows who had faced the same lonely nights, recognized the truth in his voice. Advocacy groups for children with cancer issued statements of support. Health organizations condemned the attacks on Althea as cruel and unwarranted. Hashtag shifted from ridicule to solidarity. Hale Global Ventures did not emerge unscathed. Stocks dipped again, investors bailed. But something remarkable happened in parallel. Customers and ordinary citizens began praising the company as one that dared to value humanity over profits. A fragile but genuine shift in perception stirred. Victor, watching from afar, seethed. His carefully engineered narrative was crumbling. He had wanted to paint Sebastian as a coward and Althea as a fraud. Instead, the story unfolding was one of a father clawing his way back to love, of a woman whose quiet strength had saved a child. Days later, Victor confronted Sebastian through a statement of his own, dripping with rage. You will never reclaim your empire. Sentiment is not strategy. You've chosen weakness, and weakness always loses. Sebastian, approached by reporters for a reply, didn't flinch. Standing on the courthouse steps, rain dotting his shoulders, he said simply, "Maybe I've lost the empire, but I haven't lost my daughter, and that's the only empire that matters." The words ran in headlines everywhere, dissected, debated, replayed. But in the quiet after, what mattered most wasn't the press. It was the small moment backstage of the interview, when the cameras were off and the lights cooled. Goldie threw her arms around Althea and then her father, pulling them into one embrace. Her voice was muffled against their shoulders, but clear enough. Finally, "I have a real family." Sebastian closed his eyes, holding both of them, and the hollow rooms of Halecrest Manor felt full. Not with power, not with prestige, but with the thing he had been chasing all along without knowing, the weight of belonging. The house was quieter than it had been in weeks. After the television interview, the chaos outside seemed to slow, if only for a breath. Photographers still lingered at the gates, reporters still clamored for statements, but inside Halecrest Manor, a fragile peace settled. Sebastian found himself drawn to the one room he had avoided for years, the small music parlor where Catherine used to play piano. The keys were dusted now, the bench untouched, but the memory of her hands gliding across ivory still lived there. That night, he brought Goldie into the room, sitting her beside him on the worn bench. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence carried all the heaviness of the past weeks, the fights, the sickness, the words they could never take back. Sebastian finally broke it, his voice low. "I owe you the truth, Goldie," he said. His hands folded tightly as if holding something together. "I thought if I could keep the company strong, if I kept working, I'd protect us. But I see now I was wrong. Keeping the company meant nothing if I lost you." Goldie turned her head slowly, studying his face with eyes too wise for her age. "Were you scared, Dad?" He swallowed, his throat burning. Terrified. Not just of losing the company. "I was scared of losing everything I love. First your mom, then maybe you. I thought if I focused on what I could control, the rest wouldn't hurt so much." His voice cracked. But it did. It still does. Goldie laid her small hand on top of his. "You didn't lose me, Dad. I was waiting for you to come back." That simple sentence carved through him. He had been running for so long, and yet his daughter had been there, waiting with a kind of patience he didn't deserve. In another corner of the city, Althea was facing her own turning point. For weeks, she had been painted as a fraud, her life dissected by strangers who knew nothing of her heart. But now, after Sebastian's public defense and the wave of support that followed, her name began appearing in a new light. Letters poured in from families with children battling cancer. Doctors and nurses spoke out in her defense. A pediatric foundation invited her to join a training program, tuition-free, opening a path to her dream of becoming a child therapist. Althea saw her pain transformed into purpose. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was stepping into who she was meant to be. Meanwhile, Victor's downfall came swiftly. The board of Hale Global Ventures convened, rattled by the scandal and the public backlash against his smear campaign. Investors had seen enough. In a closed session, the directors stripped Victor of his authority. The very tactics he thought would secure his power had instead destroyed it. When the announcement came, Victor issued no fiery statement, no press conference. He left the company quietly, his name whispered in hushed tones as a cautionary tale, a man who clung so tightly to control that he forgot what made life worth living. Power had been his altar, and in the end, it consumed him. For Sebastian, the news of Victor's resignation landed not with triumph, but with a quiet sense of release. There was no gloating, no celebration, only relief that the storm had finally broken and the air could clear. That evening, the three of them, Sebastian, Goldie, and Althea, sat together in the parlor again. The light from the setting sun filtered through tall windows, soft and golden, touching their faces like a benediction. Goldie leaned against her father, while Althea hummed a tune Catherine once loved. It was not a grand finale, not a victory parade. It was something gentler, something truer. The beginning of a different life. A life where company shares and headlines mattered less than the warmth of a hand on yours, or the sound of someone staying when they could have walked away. Sebastian looked at the two people beside him, and he did not feel the hollow ache of loss. He felt the weight of belonging. The last image was not of a man defeated, nor of a girl burdened, nor of a woman doubted. It was of a family forming, fragile but real, bathed in the soft glow of a new day waiting just beyond the glass. The house no longer felt like a mausoleum, where once every hallway echoed with silence and marble floors reflected only absence. Halecrest Manor began to carry softer sounds, Goldie's laughter, the distant hum of Althea's voice, and Sebastian's footsteps moving at a slower, gentler rhythm. The mansion had not changed in its bones, but the people inside it had. Sebastian was no longer the man who buried himself in quarterly reports and board meetings, while his daughter slipped further into loneliness. He still possessed wealth, still had his name etched on buildings across the city, but now his world was smaller, more grounded. Mornings found him at St. Aurelia's, sitting by Goldie's side during treatments, often reading her favorite books aloud or simply holding her hand. Afternoons he sometimes spent shadowing Althea at the hospital, quietly supporting her as she walked a path that once seemed impossible. He had learned that showing weakness was not the same as losing strength. In fact, it was the first time in years he felt strong enough to be present. Goldie herself was blossoming. The girl who once shrank under the weight of tabloids and whispers was finding her own rhythm again. Her health improved slowly, but steadily. When she returned to the piano, her fingers no longer lingered on mournful notes. Instead, she chose lighter pieces, songs that lifted rather than mourned. One evening, as her father listened, she played a simple melody, cheerful and clumsy at first, but filled with determination. "Not perfect yet," she said shyly when she finished. Sebastian leaned down, kissed the top of her head, and whispered, "It's beautiful because it's yours." Althea's transformation was just as profound. She officially left her role as a housekeeper, no longer carrying trays or tidying rooms. But she did not leave Halecrest. Instead, she stayed as part of the family, her presence woven into the fabric of the household. The staff began treating her not as an outsider, but as someone who belonged. Years passed, and the promise she once made to herself, to turn her pain into purpose, was fulfilled. After rigorous study, late nights, and endless persistence, Althea graduated as a pediatric therapist. She accepted a position at St. Aurelia's Children's Hospital, the very place she had once sat helplessly beside Goldie's bed. This time, she wasn't a bystander. She was a healer. Her past, once heavy with loss, became the root of her gift. The story of the Hale family reached a quiet resolution during a small gathering one spring evening. Goldie had just completed a successful treatment cycle, and the house was alive with a handful of close friends and supporters who had walked the road with them. The dining room, once cold and formal, glowed with warmth. Candles flickered. Laughter mingled with the clinking of glasses. Sebastian stood, a glass of wine in hand. For a moment, the room hushed, all eyes on him. He looked not like the tycoon who once ruled over Hale Global Ventures, but like a man at peace with who he had become. "I've spent a lifetime thinking power and legacy would protect what mattered," he began. "But I was wrong. None of it meant anything without the people I love beside me. Tonight, looking at my daughter alive and smiling, at Althea chasing her dream, I know the truth. His voice thickened, but he did not pause. We don't need blood to make a family. We just need the courage to stay. For a few seconds, silence filled the room. Then applause broke out, gentle at first, then growing. Some guests wiped tears. Goldie reached for her father's hand, while Althea quietly brushed away her own. Later that night, after the guests had gone and the house fell into its softer quiet, Althea slipped out into the garden. The air was cool, carrying the faint fragrance of roses Catherine once planted. The manor stretched behind her, no longer intimidating but comforting, a place she could finally call home. She paused at the edge of the path, her gaze drifting across the moonlit lawn. A smile curved her lips, warm yet tinged with determination. She knew her journey was only beginning. There would be children waiting for her at the hospital, families who needed someone to understand their pain, someone who would not turn away. The night carried the sound of faint laughter from inside. Althea closed her eyes, breathed deeply, and let it settle into her bones. She had a place. She had a purpose. And she had people who would walk beside her into whatever came next. At the end of it all, this story isn't just about a powerful man losing his company. It's about a father finally learning what it means to stay. Sometimes family isn't the one we're born into, but the one we choose to stand beside when the storms come. The question is, in your own life, would you choose power, or would you choose to stay for love? If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next journey we share together.